Hi, my name is Michele Tine, and I am an associate professor of education at Dartmouth College in the Department of Education. And I need to start with a very sincere apology. I ran into technical difficulties, which I have no doubt are completely user error on my end, and was not able to launch into my session this afternoon. So here I am instead recording it for you, so at least you have the opportunity to watch it asynchronously. And I so urge you to reach out if you have questions or comments, and we can banter on email, or we can set up a Zoom to chat through any of the data that I present to you today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen successfully this time and launch right in, because I do appreciate that we are all very busy people. So let's, you should see my screens now, as well as me in the corner. And my talk today is entitled Unique Cognitive Profiles Associated with Growing Up in Rural Poverty. And I want to explain that I'm a developmentalist. And so when we're thinking about something that's further along in development, like college access and success and transitions, I always start thinking about how we can prevent things by understanding kind of the pipeline issues. And so a lot of my work is with children, but with long-term goals in mind. So for a long time, there's been this known association between poverty and educational outcomes. And I'm not necessarily interested in redocumenting that, right? We know that unfortunately, children growing up in poverty do more poorly on basically every educational outcome that we can measure. And that has been known and documented for some time. What has been documented only more recently in the last, like almost 20 years now, is what explains that relationship. And that's this idea that there are some underlying neurocognitive functions that may lead to children growing up in poverty having a more difficult time succeeding on educational and academic tasks. And so now we have this kind of relationship and this narrative and this storyline that looks a little bit more like this. But to understand this story, we have to really understand what a neurocognitive function is even. And so I want to just take a minute to go on a little bit of a tangent to explain what neurocognitive functions are, and in specifically kind of one in good detail, because that's the one I'll unpack the most in this particular talk. And the one we're going to focus on is called working memory. And working memory capacity in humans is the amount of kind of verbal and visual information that any person can store in their mind for a short period of time, but also not just store it, but also process it, do something with it. And in many ways, we're asking students in classrooms to engage and use their working memory all of the time across all academic disciplines. So I'm going to very quickly walk you through kind of this standard model of human memory. This is Atkins and Shiffrin's kind of components of working memory. There are lots of different kind of models of working memory, all seem to explain it really well. But this one, I think, in terms of our ability to think about students and success, is the most useful model in my mind. So with working memory, you have an input from the environment, something that the teacher is saying, something the student's trying to learn, and it goes into our sensory register, right? It's there super quickly. You hear it, you see it. And then if you attend to it, it passes into your short-term memory store. And that's how we define short-term memory, as the memory, the temporary memory kind of workspace in our mind and in our brain for a long time. And then the thought is, if you can attach it to something in pre-existing long-term memory, or you repeat it enough times, or you give it meaning, it can transfer to your long-term memory. And in many ways, getting stuff into people's long-term memory is like the goal of education, right? We want them to not just be able to spit it back to us straight away, but to have that and to have it connected to other things that they know, and then be able to pull that information up at a later point in time. But when we respond to something, if you ask a student a question in a class, they have to pull that from their long-term memory into this kind of active, conscious, short-term memory store and respond. And that's kind of how we thought about memory for a long time. But this kind of short-term temporary storage here was a little bit limited in some ways. And we kind of have redefined that as working memory as opposed to short-term memory now. And the reason is because we can do a lot more than just remember exactly what we've sensed verbatim, right? We can get something through our sensory register and actually do something to it, right? I can give you a string of numbers, 4296, and you can not just repeat that string of numbers back to me, 4296, but I can ask you to add them, right? Go ahead. Yeah, that was harder than you thought it was going to be, wasn't it? So that would be working memory. That wasn't long-term memory. You've probably never added those specific numbers together before, but you can process, you can do stuff to what's in your working memory. So there's this short-term memory, this storage component of visual information and verbal information, but also this ability to process that information. And so we now think about this as working memory. So when we think of examples, the example I just gave you with numbers is a very standard psychological working memory task. Sometimes we give people lists of words and then asking them to not just repeat them in the same order, but to repeat them in backwards order. You have to do something. But I am always a little hesitant to refer to psychological tests as the best examples because I want to think about how students in classrooms are using their working memory, and they use it all the time. So if you give students a long list of directions, they have to remember that set of directions and work through it continuously as they do each step, right? If you're giving them just a lot of information to process, that's all working memory. They have to churn through that, hopefully actively, while in the classroom with you. So there's working memory. You would hope that every student's working memory is engaged during all classes. Otherwise, it's not an active learning kind of climate. So this brings us back to our story. So we've got this narrative again: poverty, neurocognitive function leading to different educational outcomes. And the truth is that research has kind of dove into this first part of the story again, in the last 10, 15, 20 years. And what we found is that children living in poverty exhibit working memory weaknesses compared to kids who are not growing up in poverty. And that's true from preschool all the way through adulthood. And then the next question would be, well, why is that the case? And the research is pretty clear that those who live in poverty experience greater chronic stress. And specifically, the chronic stress of poverty has been shown to be associated with reductions, with a slowing of the working memory development. So some of the work that showed this very elegantly was done by Evans and Schamberg. And what we see here is what they found, and this is a very oversimplified graph, but the longer that an individual lives in poverty, the proportion of their life in poverty, so the longer they live in poverty, the greater the chronic stress they experience. And in turn, the longer they live in poverty, they actually decrease their working memory abilities. And that is very atypical. We tend to see over the course of development, working memory increase in capacity with age. And so now we have this new narrative in a different direction that says poverty causes stress and that impacts working memory development. And that work, again, was documented by others almost 20 years ago. But I found this work a little bit limited, revolutionary and super important to document, but it was limited in a pretty important way, which that poverty was being defined as this kind of unilateral construct. And poverty, as we all know, exists in urban and rural areas. And the truth is, urban poverty and rural poverty are totally different beasts. I'm not saying that one is worse or better than the other, but they're just different. And so this led me to thinking that there may be differences in the way that it impacts working memory development. And when we look at the specific stressors based on the research that are kind of relevant and the most prominent in the lived lives of those in urban versus rural poverty, we see that those stressors are really different, right? So some of those rural stressors are things like underemployment, isolation, social isolation, lack of social support, lack of services, where in urban poverty, it's actually kind of to the other extreme. So we see overcrowding, excessive noise. They actually have services, although they're inadequate, a lot of crime. So it's a totally different thing. The opioid crisis is a big one now, and that's hitting rural poverty in more profound ways than urban poverty. And so I was curious if the stressors are different, and it's the stressors that are impacting working memory. Is the impact on working memory different in any way? And so I set out a study to determine if there was an association between these things. So I compared and measured visual and verbal working memory in kids living in rural and urban poverty. I also measured visual and verbal working memory for kids living in higher income rural and urban areas, so I could have some comparison. Is it the rurality and the urban context, or is it the rural poverty specifically? And I administered a battery of these working memory tasks to these kids. These started as sixth graders. And I'm going to walk quickly through some of the results and then dive a little deeper into some. So the first result was in the high income samples. There is really nothing interesting. So we've got rural here in red and urban in blue. And what we found is that there basically just weren't any visual or verbal working memory differences between rural and urban kids. And the verbal and visual working memory was about the same. So that's been documented in lots and lots and lots of studies for decades. So no surprises there, but really no interesting differences either. Where we did start to see some interesting differences was when we were looking at that lower income kind of participant pool. So a couple of things to point out here. So the first thing to show is these blue bars here were not significantly different from one another. So in the urban low-income sample, they have what I've framed as symmetrical verbal and visual working memory weaknesses, right? So I'm calling it a weakness because it was more than one standard deviation below their high-income counterparts. I use that word weakness and deficit with a lot of care. I don't like to work from a deficit model, but statistically, we are looking at a weakness here. But you can see that their verbal and visual working memory is about the same as one another. So it's something about urban poverty kind of just impacts globally working memory. Now, that was not the case in the rural sample, you'll see, though, when you look at those red bars. So in the rural, they have asymmetrical deficits. They have a relative strength in verbal working memory, in fact, and this real weakness in visual working memory, right? Their ability to think through things spatially, to work through maps in their mind. And that's different than those who lived in urban poverty. In fact, rural statistically had stronger verbal working memory than urban, and rural had weaker visual working memory than kids in urban poverty. And after I found those results as kind of it was more than a pilot, but in one study, I wanted to have the developmental spectrum, and it ends up the similar patterns have been found in middle school students, in high school students, and in college students. So it's a fairly profound, it's not like a developmental blip of some sort. So my take-home message from this very first study is just that growing up in a lower income urban context seems to be associated with kind of symmetrical working memory weaknesses in general. But growing up in a low-income rural context is unique. It's associated with what we rarely see, which are asymmetrical weaknesses with relatively strong verbal working memory. And we're going to want to think about how we can capitalize on that. And, relatively kind of weaker visual working memory. And we're going to want to think about how we can strengthen that. So before I get to interventions, then I did another study because working memory is a little bit in the space of like processes and it's not that tangible. And I really wanted to know if there are academic consequences for these students, right? So I wanted to explore other neurocognitive things outside of working memory, but really to know how are these working memory differences associated with academic achievement and outcomes. And so the second study was done on college students. Now, given they were Dartmouth college students, so they're atypical in many ways, I assure you. But the truth is, if I can find these differences in such high achieving students, the thought is that these differences would be even larger in other populations. So I gave a handful of neurocognitive tasks, a language task, an inhibition task, which if you used to go to an arcade when you were little, it's all computerized now, of course, but Remember those little like moles would pop up out of the holes and you'd have like a foam hammer and you try to whack them and hit them down. It's like that, except you have to inhibit and only hit the moles that have a hat or a vegetable or whatever it is. So it's measuring your ability to engage in a task that you're supposed to do and hold back when you're not supposed to. And then something called incidental memory, which is kind of a verbal narrative memory task. You tell stories. How many details do you remember from those stories? I then gave a reading comprehension and a math comprehension task. Those were GRE items, which were gauged at appropriate difficulty levels for these particular students. And then a whole bunch of background context information on the participants themselves. So I knew the context in which they grew up in. And what I found here was for language, nothing interesting, actually. So there were income differences, which we expected. There's tons of data showing high and low income language differences, but there was nothing specifically different with rural and urban. Where there were differences, however, was first on the inhibition. And what you can see here is that, again, those low income rural are far below these low income urban kids on this inhibition. And in some ways, generally, this is associated and aligned with that visual working memory weakness we saw before, right? Because that's not a verbal task. It's not a content task, those whacking those moles. It has to do more with kind of abstract processing. And then incidental memory, which is really remembering verbal information, we see, once again, these low-income rural kids have a relative strength compared to their low-income urban counterparts. And that's interesting. So again, it seems to suggest that different environmental stressors associated with different, growing up in different types of poverty is associated with different aspects of neurocognitive development. In rural poverty, we have this relative weakness in visual spatial memory, working memory, and inhibition. And my thought there is that perhaps it's because they use visual processing a little bit less often throughout childhood than those in an urban context, right? So think of kids in an urban context. There's very complicated, just visual maps, subways, neighborhoods. There's lots of visual stimulation, and there's less of that. It could be there is a relative strength in verbal working memory. That could be either due to a developmental asymmetry, just that their visual working memory is so weak in the rural population that they kind of compensate verbally. But I also think that there's some really strong work that I'm fascinated to look into and learn more about the power of narrative and storytelling in rural contexts and the value that the cultures place on that. And that they seem to be better at just processing and remembering that type when content is presented in that particular modality. There's likely other environmental differences that have not yet been measured for sure. So then I have these academic achievement measures, right? So then I've got math and reading, and I'm expecting these like big, profound differences, and this is going to make my career. I'm going to document how these working memory differences. I expected that visual working memory weaknesses would be associated with more difficulty in math and in science, as those are the academic domains that really tap into that visual processing. And the truth is, as you see here on the graphs, I found no differences. Low income, both groups didn't do as well as high income, expected. But low income rural versus urban, there were no sizable or at least statistically significant differences in their actual achievement. And I think that this is problematic in some ways, because this is why when there's big data sets and they look at rural versus urban, they don't see major differences. And so a lot of research has just paused and think it's unimportant to look at rural poverty as a unique context, because, hey, look, it's the same as urban poverty, and there's tons of research on urban poverty. So we can just kind of generalize what we know, but that's not the truth. And how I know that's not the truth is on the next slide, because even though there weren't differences in math and reading scores, but there was a difference, and this gets a little bit statty. So for you data nerds, you're going to be excited. And for those of you who are intimidated by stats, I promise I won't get too deep into it. But what I found was when I looked statistically and ran some models to determine the relationship between how students did on these math and reading tasks and how they did on all of these neurocognitive tasks, right? The language tasks, the whack-a-mole tasks, this incidental memory task, right? For all of the contexts, the first thing that's important to say, for no matter where you grew up, neurocognitive functioning, when you looked across those neurocognitive functions, matters, right? It's definitely accounts for a lot of your academic achievement. We knew that. These are neurocognitive functions that underlie our ability to do well academically. However, the predictor variables in my model that accounted for the variance in academic achievement varied. Now, for you math nerds, you know exactly what that means. For you not math nerds, you will become a math nerd. But what that means is that the different kids from different contexts seemed to use different processes to do math and reading, which is fascinating. So for the high income rural, high income urban, and the low income urban, language, inhibition, and incidental memory were all related to and really explained how well any given kid did on those math and reading tasks. Inhibition, that whack-a-mole task, that was the one that mattered the most. How you did on that whack-a-mole test was most closely related to how you did in math and reading. If you grew up in a high-income rural, high-income urban, or low-income urban context. But that was not the case if you grew up in a low-income rural context. In these individuals, inhibition, the whack-a-mole, was not related to academic achievement. Language and incidental memory still were, but how they did on that whack-a-mole task was not related, which means that it's like they're not using it. They're not capitalizing on it. They vary a lot more in interesting ways. So there's something interesting going on here. So that brings me to my question that I'm always asking myself, which is who the heck cares? And you too should ask this question all the time. My students at Dartmouth ask me all the time, Professor Tine, who cares? And the reason is that we care because these neurocognitive functions are really highly associated with learning. And if we know, as we now do, that there's a specific population with specific and unique neurocognitive strengths and weaknesses, we should think about, are there ways that we can cater their learning experiences to meet their needs, or at least acknowledge that they have additional obstacles here or fewer obstacles here, right? And so then the question I'm sure you're all asking is, okay, so what do we do for these low-income rural youth? And that is, in fact, $1 million question. I'll shift now to a few intervention projects that I've tried to kind of get at that question. So the first is the tinkering project. So tinkering, which is kind of this open-ended playing with things, is a really engaging approach to STEM learning, science, technology, engineering, and math. It has super high working memory demands, right? You have to know what you've done. You have to know where you're going. You have to incorporate new ideas. You have to go back and forth. And it seems like the visual working memory weaknesses that seem to be more common among low-income rural kids might kind of impede them from engaging and benefiting from tinkering programs, which are really like the hot thing right now in science museums. And so we ran a pilot study, and we did show that kids growing up in low-income rural communities are in fact less likely to kind of self-engage in tinkering activities. We measured this at the Montshire Museum of Science, and those who do engage actually stay engaged for less time. So we do see that they're less likely to want to tinker and less likely to kind of have persistence in tinkering. And that is concerning because we know that tinkering is pretty darn amazing. And so I would use that as an impetus to make kids tinker more in low-income rural areas. And that's exactly what we're hoping to do. We have plans to kind of systematically determine how we can design tinkering activities with kind of reduced memory loads that can act as a hook into tinkering. And then hypothetically, these working memory systems, the great news is that they're kind of used to develop systems. So if we can get those kids tinkering hypothetically, that improves their working memory, and then we're in great shape. Another project I've worked on is called the Build It Box project. And this was based on a lot of research showing that actually out of school STEM experiences are really the most highly associated with STEM engagement and identity in kids. So high quality science in school is important. high quality science experiences out of school, that's what makes kids jazzed about science, it ends up. The concerning thing is that out of school STEM experiences simply are far, far less available in low-income rural areas than they are in low-income urban areas. So to address that kind of void, we created a mail-based intervention, which was basically tinkering projects. So we give some open-ended instructions. We came up with 12 different kits. Here's some of the instructions. This is some of my research assistants putting together a scribble bot here. And these kids would get a box that they would take home once a month, and they would do the task, and then they'd fill out some postcard information and send it back to us to let us know that they actually did it. And the question here was, does just engaging in 12 kind of thoughtful tinkering-based experiences when they're at home improve anything for these low-income rural kids? And, the thought here was, and there's some great narratives about how these kids then had kind of like a science library at home. And so we had an experimental and a control group. The experimental group, we took pre-tests on a bunch of things. And then again, they got one box per month. And then after a year, we gave a bunch of post-tests, which I'll tell you what they were about in a second. We also did a control group because we wanted to make sure that any improvement that happened over that year wasn't just due to normal development, cognitive development, good science curriculum in school. So the control group actually took the pre-tests, and then nothing happened for a year for them. Then they took the post-tests, and then I wasn't going to rob them of the opportunity to have these kits. So we gave them all 12 kits at once to take home after they had finished the post-tests. And what we found is those kids who got a box once a month statistically improved their STEM attitudes, their STEM engagement, and their STEM knowledge compared to the kids who didn't get those over the course of the year. The thought is once they got them, those would, see the benefit. There weren't improvements in visual spatial working memory, which I was really disappointed to see, but not terribly surprised. That needle's really hard to move and takes a long time. But I was really pleased to see improvements in STEM attitude, engagement, and knowledge. And it was such it was such a fun project to create these kits and to get them into the hands of all of these kids in these low-income rural contexts. But once it was kind of executed, it was a really easy touch point, right? So just 12 kits a month, and we see these improvements, which far more expensive and laborious interventions have had trouble getting. So it was a really exciting one. And then the last project I want to talk to you about is called the Dartmouth Rural STEM Educator Partnership. It's a partnership between a handful of Dartmouth faculty, myself, Roger Sloboda, who's in the biology department, Vicki May, who's in the engineering department, some staff members, about 10 graduate students a year, the Montreal Museum of Science, and then 4 low-income rural middle schools. These are the ones that we're working with currently here. And again, this is kind of pipeline because we want to improve. If we can get that science engagement and identity and content knowledge geared up in middle school, we definitely think that these kids are going to have more success in college. And so this is a 5-year project that we are creating really hands-on science units that are relevant for middle school students. So the first one we did was on ticks, which is super relevant if you live in New England, which most of you do not. But ticks are everywhere. We have a terrible problem with Lyme disease. And so it was a really hands-on look at that. We might do bees next year, but it's been a real joy to work in. And we have a website. You can get more information and all of the curricular materials for free off of that website. But in general, when I look big picture, I argue based on the data that I've collected and the research done by so many others that it's really important to understand the unique profiles of students growing up in rural poverty. Because if we don't understand that, we can't effectively design educational interventions. And I think that that's a really important thing to do. If we don't have, effective interventions, we're not going to have effective educational practices and policies. And I really think it's important to consider when thinking about the opportunity gap. Too often, and not intentionally, but too often data about kids growing up in poverty, which is tends to be collected almost solely on kids growing up in low-income urban contexts is inadvertently generalized to those growing up in low-income rural contexts. And it's not doing them any favors, because the policy suggestions and the educational practices and the interventions aren't designed for their unique needs. So it's a real joy to think of all of you who are working with this this population who doesn't get the attention and spotlight that I certainly think that they deserve. So please hit me up with questions and comments and suggestions. Here is my contact information. If you have any questions at all, I'd be happy to. And again, I am so sorry for the technological glitches along the way. I was so looking forward to meeting so many of you. I mean, that is, I get my good ideas and I become better at what I do by speaking with all of you. And so it's a real lost opportunity for me. But please do feel free to reach out, and best of luck with everything. Thank you so much. And again, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.